The Republic of Outlaws Tortuga, the Buccaneers against the Spanish Empire. Welcome back to the channel. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up if you need to. Turn off whatever light is still on somewhere in the room. Let the warmth settle around you and let the sound of the world outside become something distant and irrelevant. Tonight, I want to tell you about an island the size of a small district on which there arose one of the strangest states in human history. A state without a king, without a parliament, without an aristocracy, and without very many laws. A state that challenged the most powerful empire of its time and held that challenge for decades. Tortuga, an island in the Caribbean Sea, 70 kilometers long and 20 wide, rocky, covered in tropical forest with a single good harbor. Populated by people the rest of the world did not want. The rejected, the fugitive, the deserter, the adventurer, and those whom fate had deposited here without a particular plan. And from this wreckage of humanity, they built something extraordinary. Settle in. I will tell you everything slowly. The name Tortuga comes from the Spanish word for turtle. The Spanish named it for its shape, elongated and humped. It does indeed resemble a great sea turtle swimming through the turquoise waters north of Hispaniola. The Spanish discovered it first, but they did not stay. Tortuga had no gold, no silver, no fertile plains suitable for plantations. It had only an inaccessible coastline, dense jungle, and an excellent natural harbor that could shelter ships of any size. For the Spanish colonial system that was looking for gold and sugar, this was an unpromising island. They marked it on the maps and moved on to more productive locations. And so others came to Tortuga. In the first half of the 17th century, French and English adventurers began arriving on the island. These were mostly people who had nothing, former soldiers discharged after the latest European war, sailors who had fled their nation's ships, escaped convicts, peasants running from poverty. They found the island and decided to stay. At first, they did what the forest and sea offered. They hunted wild pigs and cattle, descendants of animals the Spanish had brought and abandoned on the island. They cured the meat using a method they learned from the local Caribs, on wooden frames over smoldering fires. These frames were called bucan in the Carib language, and so the people who used them became buccaneers, people who smoked meat on frames. From this domestic beginning rose one of the most feared fighting forces in the Caribbean. The transition from meat smokers to sea raiders was not immediate. It happened in stages, driven by a logic that was, in its way, entirely reasonable. The Spanish colonial authorities could not allow foreign settlers so close to their Caribbean possessions. In 1638, Spanish troops landed on Tortuga and massacred most of the settlers. The survivors were driven away. The island was declared cleared. The clearing did not last a year. The French returned. With them came new people, more desperate, less inclined to compromise. People who had nowhere else to go and who had absorbed one important lesson from the massacre. The Spanish would kill them regardless, so they might as well kill first. This was the moment of transformation. The buccaneers, those quiet hunters smoking meat in the forest, became something different. They picked up weapons and went to sea. The word filibuster, from the Dutch vrijbuiter, meaning free plunderer, one who takes booty freely, passed through French and Spanish to become filibustero, and in that form entered every European language. The filibusters of Tortuga were sea raiders of a very specific kind. First, they attacked almost exclusively the Spanish. Other nations, French, English, Dutch, were, if not allies, then at least not enemies. The Spanish crown had declared the Caribbean, its internal waters, closed to foreigners. The filibusters replied that they did not recognize the declaration. Second, they operated by rules, not the laws recognized by the rest of the world, but their own. Every expedition began with the signing of a document, the Shah's Party, that specified how the plunder would be divided. The captain received more, an ordinary sailor less, but everyone knew their share before leaving port. Wounded men received compensation for lost limbs, a precisely defined sum, depending on which arm or leg had been taken. This insurance system was remarkable for any era. Lose your right arm in combat, and you were entitled to a specific payment from the collective proceeds. Lose your left hand, and a lesser, but still defined amount. Lose an eye, there was a rate for that too. The buccaneers had, in their rough and violent way, invented something resembling a workers' compensation system 2 centuries before the concept appeared anywhere else in the world. Third, on Tortuga, there was no feudal hierarchy. A captain commanded as long as he was respected and as long as he delivered success. The crew could vote to remove or replace him. Decisions were made collectively. It was savage democracy, brutal and unstable, but democracy nonetheless. The political scientist would recognize in the Tortuga arrangements something that political theorists of the period were only beginning to discuss in universities and pamphlets: the social contract. The idea that the authority of a leader derives from the consent of those he leads, that the governed have the right to withdraw that consent, that power is legitimate only when it serves those over whom it is exercised. The buccaneers had not read Hobbes or Locke. They had arrived at similar conclusions through practical necessity. When you live in a place with no king and no army and no courts, you either find a way to govern yourself or you die. The Tortuga arrangements were what governing themselves looked like. The physical environment of Tortuga shaped everything about the community that developed there. The island's northern coast was a wall of cliffs dropping straight into the sea, accessible only through a few narrow passes known to the inhabitants. The southern coast had the harbor, the single point of access for ships, commanded by a small fort that, with even a modest garrison, could hold off an attacking fleet of any size. The interior was jungle, hot, impenetrable to those who did not know it, harboring wild animals and no roads. For the people who lived there, this geography was armor. An attacking force had to come through the harbor into the guns of the fort, or it had to land on the cliff coast and climb through passes where a handful of men with firearms could hold off hundreds. The Spanish had overwhelming force elsewhere in the Caribbean. On Tortuga, geography was the great equalizer. The jungle also provided something else: food and raw materials for a community that could not rely on regular supply ships. The wild cattle and pigs that the Spanish had left behind bred and multiplied in the interior. Fresh water came from springs and streams. Timber for ship repair was abundant. The sea around the island was rich with fish. Tortuga was, in its harsh way, self-sufficient in a manner that few Caribbean settlements could match. Self-sufficiency was strategic. The Spanish could blockade a settlement that depended on supply ships from Europe. They could not blockade Tortuga because Tortuga did not depend on supply ships. The ships themselves were the community's most important asset and its primary concern. A buccaneer without a ship was just a poor man in a jungle. A buccaneer with a ship was a power in the Caribbean. The vessels used by Tortuga's raiders were mostly small, not the great galleons of the Spanish treasure fleet, but nimble sloops and brigantines that could move faster than anything the Spanish had. could operate in shallow coastal waters inaccessible to larger vessels, and could run before the wind in ways that made pursuit nearly impossible in the right weather. Speed was the fundamental tactical advantage. A buccaneer vessel could choose its targets, approach at will, and flee when the engagement became unfavorable. The Spanish could not force a battle the buccaneers were unwilling to fight. The buccaneers could force a battle at almost any time of their choosing. The men who crewed these vessels were, by any conventional military standard, an unlikely fighting force. They had no uniforms, no formal ranks beyond captain, and perhaps a lieutenant or two, no military discipline in the traditional sense. They were loud, frequently drunk when in port, argumentative, and resistant to any authority they had not personally chosen to recognize. But they were also extraordinary fighters. The marksmanship of the original buccaneers, those who had come from hunting backgrounds, was exceptional. Men who had spent years shooting wild cattle and pigs in dense jungle, where a missed shot meant no dinner, had developed proficiency with firearms that was simply not present in regular military forces of the period. A European soldier typically fired a musket in the general direction of an enemy line and hoped for the best. A buccaneer shot at specific targets and expected to hit them. This marksmanship became the primary tactical weapon in sea engagements. Rather than boarding an enemy ship immediately, the conventional approach, buccaneer crews would first systematically pick off the officers and helmsmen of the target vessel. A ship whose captain was dead, whose officers were dead, and whose helmsman was dead, was a ship that could not maneuver effectively. And a ship that could not maneuver could be boarded at leisure. The Spanish, who fought by conventional naval tactics, found this approach disorienting and extremely hard to counter. They trained their sailors to fight as sailors. They had not trained them to deal with sniper fire from a fast-moving vessel that refused to close to conventional boarding range until all the command-level targets were eliminated. Bertrand d'Ogeron de la Boère arrived on Tortuga in 1662, appointed as governor by the French West India Company. He found an island populated by several hundred men of varying nationalities, minimal formal structure, and complete contempt for any authority they had not chosen themselves. A lesser administrator would have tried to impose order by force. This would have gotten him killed. D'Ogeron did something considerably smarter. He recognized the buccaneers as what they were and tried to make them useful to France without changing their fundamental nature. He organized a formal letter of marque system, official licenses authorizing attacks on enemy shipping. Technically, the filibusters stopped being pirates and became a privatized naval force of the French crown. In practice, they continued doing exactly what they always had, but now they had a document that protected them from the gallows in any French port. D'Ogeron also did something else that proved unexpectedly consequential. He arranged for women to be brought to Tortuga. The island had a catastrophic shortage of women. The buccaneers lived and died as bachelors, which made them fearless but unstable. Men with nothing to protect and nothing to build toward have a different relationship to risk than men with families and futures. D'Ogeron organized the transportation of women from France, mostly from orphanages and correctional institutions, and offered them as potential wives to buccaneers who wanted to settle permanently. The effect was surprising. Men who took wives became more settled, more invested in the island's prosperity, more interested in the future as something worth planning for. The wild transience of the early Tortuga community began slowly to calcify into something resembling a society. D'Ogeron governed Tortuga for more than a decade. His tenure represents the closest the island ever came to functional statehood. a workable balance between the freedom that the buccaneers would not surrender and the organization that made their activities sustainable and useful to the French colonial project. He was not universally loved. The buccaneers resented any authority and tested every governor to his limits. But D'Ogeron was flexible enough to bend rather than break, and the accommodation he reached with the community was more durable than anyone might have predicted. Of all the names that passed through the harbors of Tortuga and the neighboring pirate port of Port Royal in Jamaica, none became as famous as Henry Morgan. Welsh by birth, he came to the Caribbean as a young man with nothing. He learned seamanship and the business of raiding from the bottom up through years of minor expeditions under more experienced captains. He had a natural talent for leadership, the specific kind of leadership that worked among men who recognized no authority they did not choose to recognize, and for strategy. And he had something else. He understood that the greatest fear of the Spanish was not attack from the sea. Spanish coastal cities were fortified. Their guns faced the water. Their walls were built to repel naval assault. But those same cities turned to face the sea, left their landward sides relatively exposed. The assumption was that no raiding force would approach overland. The jungle was too dense, the distances too great, the heat and disease too lethal. Morgan tested this assumption at Portobello in 1668. He landed his force several miles from the city and led them through the jungle to attack the harbor fortifications from the rear, from the direction the Spanish garrison was not watching. The city fell within hours. The sack of Portobello produced enough plunder to make Morgan's fleet wealthy and his name famous throughout the Caribbean. But it was a preliminary to something far more ambitious. In 1671, Morgan assembled the largest buccaneer fleet ever organized, 37 ships, approximately 2,000 men, and sailed for Panama. Not the port of Panama, the city of Panama on the Pacific coast of the isthmus. To reach it, he had to cross the Darien, the jungle that connected North and South America, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. There were no roads. There was heat and humidity that could kill. There were insects carrying diseases that had already killed more European soldiers than Spanish swords. There were indigenous populations who did not welcome intruders. Morgan led his men across anyway. The crossing took 2 weeks. By the end of it, the force was starving, sick, and exhausted. They had eaten their leather bags and belts to survive. Some had not survived at all. And then they came out of the jungle onto the Pacific plain and saw Panama before them. The Spanish governor of Panama had assembled a defensive force, cavalry, infantry, fighting bulls, driven toward the attacking force to break their ranks. By conventional military assessment, the battered force that emerged from the jungle should not have been able to fight anyone. They destroyed the Spanish defense in hours. Panama burned for weeks. The plunder was enormous, though Morgan's men always complained afterward that he had taken more than his agreed share. And the question of exactly what happened to the treasure of Panama was never fully resolved. Morgan returned to Port Royal, a hero to his men and an embarrassment to the English crown, which was at that moment trying to negotiate peace with Spain and did not want a wildly successful raid on the most important city in Spanish America, complicating the diplomacy. He was arrested, shipped to London, put on trial, and then knighted. Sir Henry Morgan became Deputy Governor of Jamaica in 1675. The same man who had burned Panama 4 years earlier, now charged with suppressing piracy in the Caribbean. He performed this latter duty with considerable energy, hanging former colleagues with a thoroughness that suggested he understood the necessity of closing a chapter of history that he himself had written. This transformation, the pirate who became the policeman, tells the whole story of Tortuga's fate in miniature. The Spanish Empire that the buccaneers had tormented for decades was not ultimately defeated by sea raiders. It was eroded by the accumulated cost of defending its Caribbean territories, by the economic development of rival colonial powers, by the gradual shift of global trade that made Caribbean silver less central to European power than it had once been. The buccaneers contributed to this erosion. Their raids disrupted Spanish commerce, diverted Spanish military resources, demonstrated repeatedly that the empire's supposed dominance of Caribbean waters was a fiction. Every Portobello, every Panama, every Spanish merchant vessel taken off Hispaniola was evidence that the closed sea the Spanish crown had declared was not closed at all. But the buccaneers did not destroy the Spanish Empire. Nobody destroyed it. It dissolved slowly and unevenly across 2 centuries under the pressure of its own contradictions and the competition of more adaptable powers. And as the strategic value of the buccaneers diminished, as France and England moved toward formal accommodation with Spain, as the Caribbean became less a frontier to be contested and more a commercial territory to be administered, the tolerance that had made Tortuga possible began to evaporate. The treaty making of the 1680s sealed it. France and England both agreed to suppress piracy in their Caribbean territories in exchange for Spanish recognition of their colonial possessions. The governments that had quietly encouraged the buccaneers for decades now found it convenient to classify them as criminals. The buccaneers, who had served French and English interests for 40 years, were now an inconvenience to those interests. The letter of marque system that had given them legal cover was wound down. The tacit protection of governors like d'Ogeron was replaced by active suppression. Some buccaneers accepted the change. They settled on Hispaniola as planters, channeling the same energy that had made them effective raiders into building the plantation system that would make Saint-Domingue, the French half of Hispaniola, the most productive colonial territory in the world. The wealth that sustained 18th century France came in significant part from plantations worked by enslaved Africans, established by former buccaneers who had traded their weapons for whips. This is the darkest dimension of the Tortuga story, and the one that the romantic version of buccaneer history most consistently omits. The freedom of Tortuga was freedom for a specific group, white European men who had rejected the hierarchies of their birth. It was built in part on the enslavement and exploitation of others, and when the buccaneers became settlers and planters, they participated enthusiastically in that system. Others went elsewhere, east to Madagascar and the Indian Ocean, where the trade routes were rich and the reach of European navies was still limited. The pirate settlements of Madagascar in the 1690s and early 1700s were populated largely by Caribbean veterans who had carried the Tortuga model to a new ocean. They thrived for a generation and then were suppressed in their turn as the European navies extended their reach. Others simply vanished from the historical record, absorbed into the populations of various Caribbean islands, dying of disease or violence or age, becoming the ancestors of people who would have no particular reason to know or remember what their forebears had been. Tortuga itself became a French colonial possession of no special importance. The rocky island that had once been the capital of Caribbean raiding became a quiet backwater. Planters grew tobacco and later coffee. Enslaved Africans replaced the free buccaneers as the primary labor force. The harbor that had sheltered 100 raid ships saw only fishing boats and occasional colonial supply vessels. When the Haitian Revolution came in 1791, the only successful slave revolution in history, the uprising that destroyed the plantation system and created the first black republic in the world, Tortuga was part of the territory that became Haiti. The descendants of the enslaved people who had replaced the buccaneers rose up against the system that buccaneers had helped build, and they won. There is a justice in this sequence that the history does not quite state, but that is visible if you look at the whole arc. The men who came to Tortuga came because they rejected a world that had rejected them, a world of fixed hierarchy, of birth determining destiny, of the powerful taking what they wanted from those without power to resist. They built something different, imperfect, violent, temporary, but genuinely different. A place where a man's origins did not determine his standing, where competence and courage counted more than birth, where the leader served at the pleasure of the led. And then they helped build a world as brutal and hierarchical as the one they had fled, just organized differently, with European men at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom. And then the people at the bottom destroyed that system and built something of their own. The Caribbean is a place where nothing stays the same for very long. The jungle grows over everything. The sea takes what it wants. The stories accumulate in layers, each one pressed down by the weight of the next, until the bottom layers are almost unreachable. The buccaneers of Tortuga are one of those bottom layers now. Their harbor is still there. The cliffs they knew are still there. The water is still the same impossible blue it was when they anchored their black-hulled sloops in the shadow of those cliffs and went below to count their plunder. But there is more to the Tortuga story than the romance of sea raiders and their democratic arrangements. There is also the question of what they were doing, and why it worked when it did, and why it stopped working when it did. The Spanish Empire in the 17th century was in many ways the dominant global power. Its mines in Mexico and Peru produced silver in quantities that had no precedent in human history. That silver flowed to Spain along predictable sea routes. The treasure fleets that crossed the Atlantic on a regular schedule, stopping at Havana and other Caribbean ports before making the crossing. These treasure routes were the economic lifeline of the Spanish state. Without the silver, Spain could not pay its armies. Without its armies, Spain could not maintain its European dominance or defend its colonial possessions. The entire structure of Spanish imperial power rested on the reliable transfer of American silver to European Spain. The buccaneers understood this instinctively, without the benefit of economic analysis. They did not think in terms of disrupting Spanish imperial finance. They thought in terms of where the richest targets were. But the effect of their raids was precisely to disrupt Spanish imperial finance, to inject unpredictability into a system that depended on predictability, to force the Spanish to spend money defending routes and ports that would otherwise have been productive. Every galleon that had to be armed, crewed by soldiers rather than purely by sailors, and escorted by warships, was a galleon that cost more to operate and delivered less revenue than an unescorted merchant vessel would have. Every fortification that had to be built and garrisoned along the Caribbean coast diverted resources from other uses. The cumulative cost of the buccaneer threat to the Spanish treasury was enormous. even in years when the Buccaneers themselves were not particularly successful. This strategic dynamic, using small, fast, self sustaining forces to impose disproportionate costs on a larger and more powerful adversary, is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. The Buccaneers did not invent it, but they practiced it with unusual consistency and effectiveness for an unusually long period. What made it sustainable was exactly the self sufficiency that Tortuga's geography permitted. The Buccaneers did not need the Spanish to stop hunting them. They only needed the Spanish to be unable to catch them, which the terrain and their own speed ensured. And they did not need the European powers to keep providing them with letters of marque and political support. Although this helped, they needed only to keep finding targets richer than the cost of the expedition that captured them. For 40 years, the arithmetic worked in their favor. The communities that formed around Tortuga and Port Royal were not only military phenomena, they were social experiments running in parallel with the political philosophy that was developing in Europe. The ideas about consent, about the limits of authority, about the rights of individuals against the power of states, and reaching similar conclusions through entirely different means. A buccaneer who had signed a chasse party and sailed into the Caribbean understood, in a practical and immediate sense, what it meant to enter into an agreement with other people for mutual benefit and mutual obligation. He understood that the captain's authority derived from the crew's agreement to recognize it. He understood that the rules existed to serve everyone who had agreed to them, and that rules that did not serve this purpose could be changed. He had not read the social contract theorists. He was living the social contract theory in a way that was brutal and frequently violent and limited to a specific group of people, but that was also within those limits remarkably coherent. The question of how permanent the Tortuga arrangements might have been, whether they could have developed into something more lasting, more inclusive, more formally institutionalized, is one that history does not allow to be answered. The forces that ended the Buccaneer Republic were external: the diplomatic calculations of European powers, the growing reach of colonial administration, the economic transformation of the Caribbean from contested frontier to organized plantation territory. The Buccaneers did not defeat themselves. They were closed down from outside by the same powers that had once found them useful. This is, in its way, the most interesting fact about the Tortuga Republic. It did not fall because its internal arrangements proved unworkable. It fell because it became inconvenient to people with more power than it had. The harbor at Tortuga is quiet now. The fishing boats go out in the morning and come back in the afternoon. The cliffs catch the first light in a way that has not changed in 400 years. The water is still the color of blue that people from colder places spend their whole lives trying to describe accurately and never quite managing. The men who anchored here and went ashore to drink and argue and plan the next raid and divide the plunder and occasionally to sleep under an actual roof. Those men are gone. The ships are gone. The world they operated in is gone. But the harbor is still there. And the sea is still there. And somewhere in the accumulated centuries of this place, in the coral and the cliff and the particular quality of the Caribbean light, the traces of what happened here persist. A group of men who had nothing built something from nothing. It did not last. Most things do not last. But while it lasted, it was real. And it was, in its rough and violent and limited way, free. The waves come in the same way they always have, one after another, unhurried, spending themselves on the same rocks they have always spent themselves on. The Caribbean Sea, in the 17th century, was a different kind of ocean than it is today. Today, it is a tourist ocean, blue and warm and dotted with cruise ships and resort islands and carefully managed coral reefs. The history sits beneath the surface in the form of Spanish galleons and plantation foundations and the bones of people who crossed it against their will. But the surface itself is smooth and inviting and commercially organized. In the 17th century, it was a frontier, a contested space where the rules of European civilization applied only imperfectly, where the reach of any nation's navy extended only as far as that navy could project force on any given day, where the distance between a functioning colonial administration and a complete absence of governance might be measured in a single day's sail. Frontiers produce specific kinds of people and specific kinds of communities. The people who end up on frontiers are disproportionately those for whom the settled world has not worked, either because it rejected them or because they rejected it. They bring with them the skills and habits of their origins and then adapt those skills and habits to the conditions they find. The buccaneers were a frontier people in this precise sense. They came from the margins of European society, the discharged soldiers, the escaped servants, the religious dissidents, the simply desperate, and they found on the Caribbean frontier a set of conditions that turned their marginality into a form of strength. Their very lack of connection to the European social order meant they had nothing to lose by operating outside it. A man who owns land, who has family, who has position in a community, has something to protect. He thinks twice before acts that might cost him what he has. A man who has none of these things thinks only once, or not at all. The specific geography of Tortuga intensified this psychology. The island's inaccessibility meant that every person there had chosen, in some meaningful sense, to be there. You did not end up on Tortuga by accident the way you might end up in a coastal town. You went there deliberately, knowing what it was, and the act of going there was itself a statement about who you were and what you were willing to do. This self-selection produced a community with an unusual uniformity of psychological type, not in background, which was enormously varied, but in attitude. People on Tortuga had decided to be there. That decision had already cost them whatever they had been before. They had nothing left to protect and everything to gain. This combination produced a ferocity in action and a tolerance for risk that more settled communities could not match. The ships were everything. On an island with no agricultural surplus worth exporting, no mineral resources, no manufacturing capacity, the only way to acquire wealth was to take it from someone else. And the only way to take it from someone else in the Caribbean was to go to sea. The process of fitting out a buccaneer vessel was itself a collective economic enterprise. A captain who wanted to mount an expedition had to assemble not just a crew, but the capital to feed and arm that crew for the duration of the voyage. He might put in his own share. Investors from the Tortuga community, merchants, tavern owners, women who ran the island's limited commercial establishments, might contribute in exchange for a share of the proceeds. The Shah's party specified everyone's stake. This was venture capital in its earliest form, a group of people pooling resources for a risky enterprise with a defined return structure if the enterprise succeeded. The Spanish galleon was the investment opportunity. The buccaneer crew was the operational team. The Shah's party was the partnership agreement. The economics were harsh. Many expeditions returned with nothing. Crews that found no targets, or that found targets they could not take, came back empty and had to start again. The insurance provisions in the Shah's party meant that even a failed expedition left its wounded members with something. But a healthy man on a failed voyage got nothing. Successful expeditions could be transformatively profitable. A rich Spanish merchant vessel, taken cleanly, without the cost of a protracted fight that would leave many of the crew dead or wounded, could produce returns that let every member of the crew live well for months. A city like Portobello or Panama was another order of magnitude entirely, the kind of windfall that passed into legend and attracted adventurers from across the Caribbean. This boom and bust economy was simultaneously the source of the community's energy and the source of its instability. The months after a great success were months of prodigal spending. The taverns of Tortuga and Port Royal did their best business when a fleet came back rich. The months after a series of failed expeditions were months of poverty and desperation that sharpened the willingness to take risks on the next voyage. Port Royal deserves more attention alongside Tortuga because the two locations were functionally a single community spread across two islands. Port Royal was the buccaneer capital of the English Caribbean, a city on a spit of land at the entrance to Kingston Harbor in Jamaica, sheltered from storms by the mountains of the island and positioned at the crossing point of several major Caribbean shipping lanes. In the 1660s and 1670s, it was reputedly the richest city in the Americas and certainly one of the most degenerate. The accounts of Port Royal in this period are extraordinary. Its taverns ran continuously. Its streets were full of people spending recently acquired plunder on anything that could be bought. Its population of several thousand was crammed into a space suitable for a few hundred, in buildings that were going up as fast as they could be constructed to house the commerce the buccaneers generated. In 1692, Port Royal was destroyed by an earthquake and the tsunami that followed it. 2,000 people died in minutes. Much of the city slid into the harbor. The survivors saw the disaster as divine judgment on a city of sin, and perhaps the theology is less interesting than the practical observation that a city built on sand, projecting into the sea on a Caribbean fault line, was always going to be vulnerable to exactly what destroyed it. The destruction of Port Royal accelerated the decline that was already underway. The treaty process of the 1680s had already begun to formalize the suppression of buccaneering. The earthquake removed the physical infrastructure of the trade. The two events together, political and geological, closed a chapter that had been closing anyway. The figure of the pirate captain in popular imagination, the charismatic leader, the democratic commander, the man who built loyalty through shared success and shared danger, is based in significant part on the real captains who operated out of Tortuga and Port Royal in this period. Some of them were genuinely remarkable people. Morgan has been discussed, but there were others whose careers were in some ways more representative of what the buccaneer world actually was. Lorenz de Graaf was a Dutch filibuster who became one of the most feared raiders in the Caribbean in the 1670s and 1680s. He was unusual in several respects. He was known as a capable navigator and tactician, not just a fighter, but a genuine strategic thinker by the standards of the period. And he had a reputation for unusual restraint in his treatment of prisoners, which was not universal among his contemporaries. The treatment of prisoners was one of the persistent moral questions of the buccaneer world. The Chas Party specified how plunder would be divided, but it said less about what happened to the people on the ships and in the cities that were taken. In practice, this varied enormously. Some captains released prisoners intact after taking the valuables, Others used torture to extract information about hidden caches of money. Others were simply violent in ways that seemed to have had no particular strategic purpose. The violence that surrounded the buccaneer world was not incidental to it, it was structural. Men who lived entirely outside the law, who had no courts to appeal to and no authority capable of protecting them, who operated in an environment where their own survival depended on being more dangerous than the people they encountered. Such men developed relationships with violence that were different from what was normal, even in the violent 17th century. This is one of the aspects of the Tortuga story that the romantic version consistently underweights. The democratic arrangements, the insurance provisions, the social contract elements, these were real and interesting. But they coexisted with ordinary brutality that is harder to romanticize. The Spanish, who were captured and tortured for the location of their money, were real people. The enslaved Africans, whose labor built the plantations that replaced buccaneer raids as the Caribbean economy's foundation, were real people. The indigenous Caribs, whose knowledge the buccaneers had borrowed and whose world they were helping to end, were real people. The history of Tortuga is interesting precisely because it contains all of these things simultaneously. The genuinely novel social arrangements and the ordinary brutality, the freedom for some and the exploitation of others, the democratic impulse and the violent practice. It resists simplification. That is what makes it worth understanding. The nightlife of Tortuga was famous throughout the Caribbean, and not for reasons that would have satisfied a conventional moralist. The taverns were the center of the community's social life. They were places where deals were made, where captains recruited crews, where the proceeds of successful raids were spent with an enthusiasm that reflected both the genuine pleasure of having money and the unconscious awareness that it might not last. Music was constant in these establishments. The buccaneers brought with them the musical traditions of their various origins: French folk songs, English ballads, Dutch drinking songs, African rhythms introduced by the growing presence of enslaved people on the islands. The Caribbean musical tradition that developed in this period was a genuine synthesis, the product of multiple cultures meeting in a single place under conditions that dissolved the normal boundaries between them. The gambling was legendary. Dice and cards were the primary entertainment, and men who had been at sea for months with nothing to spend their boredom on came ashore ready to risk everything they had just acquired on the turn of a card. Fortunes made in a morning raid were gone by evening. This was not seen as tragedy. It was seen as the natural circulation of wealth in a community where hoarding was considered poor form and spending was a social obligation. The language of Tortuga was as mixed as its population. The operational language was probably French. France controlled the island formally, and French buccaneers were numerically dominant. But the community communicated across national lines in a Creole mixture of French, English, Dutch, Spanish, and whatever elements of African and Carib languages had been absorbed along the way. This linguistic mixing was itself a kind of political statement. The buccaneers had left behind the national identities that language normally carries. A Frenchman who spent 10 years on Tortuga, who crewed ships with Englishmen and Dutchmen, and men of no clear national origin, who communicated in a language that belonged to none of them exclusively. This man was not quite French anymore. He was something that did not have a name yet. The Caribbean Creole cultures that developed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Cultures that were not European, not African, not indigenous, but something genuinely new, made from elements of all three. Began in part from experiments like Tortuga, The freedom from national identity that the Buccaneers practiced, however imperfect and however limited, planted seeds that grew into something far larger than any of them intended. The Spanish response to the Buccaneer threat evolved considerably over the decades of the challenge. The initial response was punitive and direct. Send troops to Tortuga, kill the inhabitants, declare the problem solved. This worked twice. The island was cleared in 1635 and again in 1638. Both times the buccaneers returned. The Spanish then tried a more sustained naval approach, maintaining patrols in the waters around Tortuga and Hispaniola to intercept raiding vessels before they could cause damage. This had limited success. The buccaneers had better local knowledge than the patrol ships, could move faster, and could shelter in coastal waters where deep draft warships could not follow. The fortification of major ports was expensive but partially effective. Portobello, after Morgan's raid, was massively strengthened. The treasure fleet routes were modified to be less predictable. Convoys were organized with escort vessels that made individual merchant ships much harder targets. None of these measures eliminated the buccaneer threat. They contained it, redirected it, made specific targets harder. But the buccaneers responded by finding new targets, attacking smaller, less protected locations, moving to different trade routes, adapting the tactics to whatever defenses the Spanish had deployed most recently. This adaptability was the buccaneers' greatest strategic asset. The Spanish had to defend everywhere. The buccaneers had to attack only where the Spanish were weakest. The asymmetry was permanent and unfixable within the Spanish system. The only thing that ended the buccaneer threat was the political decision by France and England to stop tolerating it. And even that decision took decades to implement fully against men who had proven extraordinarily difficult to catch and who had the goodwill of the Caribbean populations that depended on the trade the buccaneers generated. Jamaica, after Morgan's time, provides a kind of coda to the whole story. The island became, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, one of the most productive plantation territories in the British Empire, producing sugar with the labor of enslaved Africans in quantities that made its planters among the wealthiest people in the British world. The harbour that had sheltered buccaneer fleets now sheltered merchant vessels carrying sugar to Bristol and London. The transition was not instantaneous. For decades after Port Royal's destruction, Jamaica remained a place where the boundary between legitimate commerce and outright piracy was blurry. The pirates who operated from Caribbean bases in the early 18th century, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonnie, Mary Red, were in some sense the last generation of the Tortuga tradition, carrying it forward into a world that was increasingly closing down the spaces where it could operate. The suppression of Atlantic piracy in the 1720s, the coordinated campaign by British naval forces that ended with most of the prominent pirate captains hanging from gibbets in Nassau or at Execution Dock in London, was the final chapter. The frontier was closed. The Caribbean became fully colonial, fully administered, fully integrated into the Atlantic economic system as a producer of plantation goods. The freedom that Tortuga had represented, rough and violent and limited as it was, ceased to have a geography. There was nowhere left where you could go to be outside the system entirely. The island itself is still there. It is called Ile de la Tortue now, part of Haiti, off the northwest coast of the troubled and beautiful country. The population is a few thousand. The economy is fishing and limited agriculture. There are no gold rush fortunes, no returning raids, no nights of prodigal spending in harborside taverns. But the cliffs are still there. The harbor is still there. The water is still that blue that belongs to this specific part of the world and nowhere else. If you stand on the cliff above the harbor on a clear day and look south toward Hispaniola, you can see the mountains of Haiti in the distance. The same mountains the buccaneers saw when they looked toward the source of the wild cattle that started everything. The sea between the island and the mainland is the same sea it always was, moving, bright, indifferent to the centuries of history that have played out on its shores and across its surface. The buccaneers are gone. Their ships are gone. Their republic is gone. The sea is still here. And in the harbor, if the light is right, you can almost see the shadow of a fast black hull rounding the headland, moving with the wind, going somewhere with purpose, belonging to no nation and acknowledging no authority but its own speed and the agreement of the men aboard it. Almost. What does it mean to build a free place? This question runs through the Tortuga story in ways that are never quite stated explicitly, but that are present in every aspect of what happened there. The men who came to Tortuga were not political philosophers. They were not building an experiment in political theory. They were trying to survive and then to thrive in conditions that the world they had come from had given them no tools for. But the arrangements they built, the Shas Party, the democratic captaincy, the collective decision making, the insurance provisions, were answers to political questions even if the people who built them did not think of them in those terms. The political question was, how do you create a functioning community among people who have no external authority binding them, who have not agreed to any pre-existing set of rules, who come from different places with different customs and different languages, who have nothing in common except their presence in this specific place? The answer the Buccaneers found was through agreements, through the explicit negotiation of terms before any joint enterprise, through the creation of rules that everyone could agree to, because everyone could see what they got from them. This was not the answer that the political tradition of their time would have given. The political tradition of the 17th century said that order came from authority, from a king, from a church, from an established hierarchy that everyone recognized, and that was backed by force sufficient to compel those who did not recognize it voluntarily. The idea that order could emerge from below, from the agreements of ordinary people rather than the commands of established power, was radical. It was the idea that was being developed by people like Locke and later Rousseau in terms that educated Europeans could discuss. The buccaneers had not read Locke, but they were doing what Locke described in conditions that were entirely practical and entirely unsentimental about it. This is one of the things that makes the Tortuga story historically interesting, beyond its obvious surface appeal. The adventure, the violence, the romance of the Sea Raiders. It is a case study in political improvisation, in the capacity of people under pressure to find workable arrangements for living together without the benefit of inherited institutions. The lessons are not entirely comfortable. The arrangements the buccaneers built were limited in who they included. The freedom of Tortuga was freedom for a specific group, predominantly white European men. Women on the island existed primarily in the roles that D'Ogeron had designed for them, as stabilizing influences, as wives who would give the men something to protect and build toward. Indigenous people were not part of the community. They were suppliers of knowledge and sometimes allies against the Spanish, but they did not vote on Shas parties or share in the proceeds. And the enslaved Africans who were increasingly present in the Caribbean as the plantation economy expanded were entirely outside whatever political arrangements the buccaneers had built. Some buccaneers raided slave ships, some participated in the slave trade. Some crews included formerly enslaved men, and there is evidence of black buccaneers operating with the same formal rights as their white counterparts. But this was exceptional, not the norm. The freedom that Tortuga represented was real within its limits. The limits were significant and cannot be ignored. The longer arc of Caribbean history makes this visible. The plantation economy that replaced the Buccaneer Republic, that was built in part by former buccaneers who channeled their energy into agriculture, was one of the most brutal systems of human exploitation in modern history. The sugar that sweetened the coffee of European consumers was produced by enslaved people working in conditions designed to extract maximum labor in minimum time, regardless of the human cost. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 was the answer to this system. It was the largest and most successful slave revolt in history. It produced the first black republic in the world, and it happened on the island where buccaneers had first established the Republic of Outcasts, where the idea that people who had been cast out by the dominant system could build something of their own had first taken recognizable shape. There is no direct line of causation from the buccaneers to the Haitian Revolution. The enslaved Africans who rose up in 1791 were not inspired by the example of the buccaneers. Their inspiration was the French Revolution, their own religious traditions, their own centuries of accumulated resistance, and its occasional explosive release. But the island itself carries both histories. The rocky harbor that sheltered buccaneer ships and the mountain fortresses where Haitian rebels held off the armies of Napoleon are part of the same geography. The question that both histories ask, what does it mean to build a free place, is the same question, asked by very different people under very different circumstances. The buccaneers answered it for themselves, within their limits, for a few decades. The Haitian revolutionaries answered it more completely, more inclusively, at greater cost, and produced something that has lasted, however battered and contested, into the present day. The Caribbean light at the end of the day is something that people who have seen it describe in ways that never quite capture it. It is not the golden hour of European painting. It is something sharper and warmer and more saturated. The light of a place that is genuinely close to the sun, where the water reflects and amplifies what the sky provides. In this light, the harbor at Tortuga is beautiful. The cliffs catch it. The water holds it for a moment before the dark comes. And in the dark, the stars are different than they are in northern latitudes. They are lower, more present, more immediate. The buccaneers navigated by them, by the Southern Cross and by stars that were not visible from the ports they had come from. Learning the Caribbean sky was part of learning to operate in the Caribbean, part of the process of becoming something different from what you had been before you came here. To navigate by unfamiliar stars is a particular kind of freedom. It means the old charts do not work anymore. It means you have to learn where you are from where you are, not from where you came from. The buccaneers did this literally. They did it figuratively as well. They abandoned the maps that European society had given them. The maps that said, here is your place, here is what you deserve, here is what is possible for a person of your birth and your class and your nation. And they made new maps from what they found. The maps they made were imperfect. They left out large portions of the territory. They were accurate in some places and wrong in others. They served the people who made them and not necessarily anyone else. but they were real maps of a real place, made by people who had actually been there. The buccaneers of Tortuga were not heroes. They were not villains. They were people, complicated, violent, creative, limited, occasionally admirable, and frequently not, who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and responded to it in ways that were sometimes extraordinary and sometimes entirely ordinary. What they built was not a utopia. It was a rough place where rough people lived rough lives and occasionally did things that were genuinely remarkable and occasionally did things that were genuinely terrible. But for a few decades, it was real. It was theirs. And in the waters around it, for a few decades, the most powerful empire in the world could not catch them. That is something. The harbor at Tortuga as the sun goes down. The water turning from blue to green to grey to black. The stars beginning to appear over the mountains of Haiti across the channel. The fishing boats coming in with whatever the sea gave today. The sounds of a small island settling into the night. Whatever happened here, whatever was built and lost and built again and lost again, this is still here. The place is still here. The water is still here. And somewhere in the depth of this particular water, in the wrecks and the sediment and the accumulated centuries of the thing, the echo of something that was built from nothing by people who had nothing persists. It is faint, it is not sufficient, it is not the whole story, but it is there. The ships themselves deserve more attention than they usually receive in accounts of the buccaneer world. A 17th century sailing vessel was a machine of extraordinary complexity for its time, a technology that required years to master, that demanded from its operators a combination of physical skill, mathematical knowledge, and practical experience that was essentially impossible to acquire quickly. The men who could sail ships well were among the most valuable people in the maritime world, and their value was reflected in the competition between navies and merchant fleets for the services. The buccaneers recruited from this population former Navy sailors who had deserted or been discharged, former merchant sailors who had decided that the wages on legitimate vessels were insufficient compensation for the risks, men who had grown up in fishing communities and learned seamanship from childhood. This gave the buccaneer fleets a technical capability that was not always obvious from their appearance. A buccaneer vessel was typically understated. No bright paint, no decorative carving, no display of the maritime wealth that the Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch merchant fleets used to communicate status and success. The buccaneer ship was black-hulled, tarred against the tropical marine organisms that would otherwise eat through wooden planking in months. It was rigged for speed rather than cargo capacity. It carried more guns than a comparable merchant vessel, positioned for offensive action rather than defensive positioning. And it was crewed by people who were motivated in a way that Navy sailors and merchant sailors were not. The buccaneer crew member had a financial stake in the outcome of every voyage. His pay depended directly on the success of the enterprise. This is different from a Navy sailor who received his wages regardless of outcome, or a merchant sailor who was paid for the voyage rather than for the value of what the voyage produced. This alignment of incentive with outcome produced a kind of initiative and adaptability that was harder to find in more conventional maritime forces. A buccaneer sailor who noticed an opportunity, a Spanish vessel off course, a poorly guarded anchorage, a coastal settlement that had let its guard down, had a personal interest in communicating that opportunity to the captain. He would share in any resulting gain. He did not need an officer to observe things for him. This distributed alertness was a tactical advantage that the Spanish found difficult to counter. Their naval forces operated on the principle that observation was the officer's function and execution was the sailor's function. The buccaneers operated on the principle that every man was responsible for noticing useful things, because every man's income depended on acting on useful things. The maintenance of the vessels was similarly collective. A buccaneer ship needed constant attention in tropical waters. The fouling of the hull by marine growth, the swelling and warping of timber in heat and humidity, the oxidation of iron fittings, the deterioration of rope and sail in salt air. A crew that understood the vessel as a shared asset rather than someone else's property took better care of it. The chasse party typically included provisions for the maintenance cost of the vessel and for the acquisition of replacement ships when needed. The capture of new vessels was one of the primary ways buccaneer fleets expanded. A successful raid that took a Spanish vessel in good condition was an opportunity to add to the fleet, to repair and rearm the captured ship, and send it out on the next expedition. This accounted for part of the extraordinary growth of Morgan's fleet at its height. He was not building ships, he was capturing them. The navigation of the Caribbean required knowledge that only local experience could provide. The charts that European cartographers had produced for the region were incomplete and often inaccurate. The Caribbean had been systematically surveyed only along the major trade routes, and even those surveys had errors that could be fatal to a navigator who trusted them too completely. The buccaneers accumulated local knowledge over decades of operating in these waters. They knew where the shoals were, which channels could be navigated at low tide, which anchorages were sheltered from which winds, which stretches of coast offered emergency landing places, and which were cliffs with no approach. This knowledge lived in the heads of experienced men and was passed on orally, from captain to apprentice, from experienced sailor to new recruit, through the accumulated shared understanding of a community that spent its working life in a specific geography. The Spanish had charts, the buccaneers had knowledge. In the Caribbean, knowledge was frequently more valuable. The weapons that the buccaneers carried were an expression of the same practical logic that shaped everything else about their operations. The firearms of the period, the flintlock musket and its variations, were expensive, maintenance intensive, slow to reload, and unreliable in wet conditions. For a naval force that operated in the Caribbean, with its constant humidity and frequent rain, this unreliability was a significant problem. A musket that failed to fire because its powder had gotten wet was worse than no musket at all, because the man holding it believed himself armed and behaved accordingly until the moment of failure. The buccaneers solved this through quantity and maintenance. Every man carried multiple firearms, typically 2 or 3 pistols in addition to a musket, and devoted considerable effort to keeping them dry and functional. The leather cartridge boxes that carried powder and shot were treated to resist moisture. The weapons were inspected before engagement, not after. They also carried edged weapons as a secondary armament, cutlasses rather than the longer swords of European cavalry, because the confined spaces of a ship's deck rewarded shorter weapons that could be used without the room for a full swing. The cutlass became so associated with the buccaneer world that it is now the primary weapon of pirate imagery, even though the firearms were typically used first and the cutlass was the backup for close combat. The boarding action was the culmination of a buccaneer attack, but it was preceded by a process of attrition that made the boarding less costly. The sniper fire that targeted officers and helmsmen was followed, if the target vessel had not yet surrendered, by the use of stink pots. ceramic vessels filled with burning sulfur, and other unpleasant materials that were hurled onto the deck to fill the air with choking fumes. And by grappling hooks that pulled the vessels together and could not be easily freed, once set. Once alongside, the boarders went over in a wave. The goal was speed and ferocity rather than formation, to overwhelm the defenders before they could organize a coordinated resistance. Men who had been shooting for 20 minutes at their offices and who were now gagging on sulfur fumes were not in a good position to organize coordinated resistance. This tactical system was not elegant. It was not the product of formal military training or classical tactical doctrine. It was the product of many years of practical experience, of trying different approaches and retaining what worked, of sharing lessons between expeditions in the taverns and harbors of Tortuga and Port Royal. It worked consistently against Spanish vessels that were crewed as merchant ships with a military overlay, against a properly prepared warship with a disciplined crew, expecting attack. It was considerably less reliable. The buccaneers were not invincible. They suffered defeats, lost ships, lost men, but their win rate against the targets they actually chose, merchant vessels and coastal settlements rather than warships, was high enough to sustain the enterprise for decades. The question of what happened to the money is one that runs through every account of the buccaneer world. The simple answer is that most of it was spent. The buccaneer culture of conspicuous consumption, the prodigal spending in port after a successful voyage, was not simply irresponsibility, though it was that too. It was also a cultural statement. A man who saved his money was implicitly planning for a future in which the money would be useful. The buccaneer culture did not plan for futures of that kind. You might be dead next voyage. You might be captured. The world might change in ways that made your money worthless. Spend it now on things that provide immediate pleasure, and at least you had the pleasure. This orientation toward immediate experience rather than deferred gratification was one of the things that made the buccaneers simultaneously so effective in the short term and so unsustainable in the long term. They were optimized for the present moment. Building lasting structures required a different relationship with time. Dogeron understood this and tried to change it by introducing women and the prospect of settled family life. The change worked partially and for some men. Others remained oriented toward the sea and the next voyage until they were too old or too damaged to continue. The men who settled became planters. The men who could not settle went east to the Indian Ocean, where the tradition continued for another generation before being suppressed in its turn. The men who were simply unable to exist in any organized social framework died or disappeared into the populations of various Caribbean islands or became the Blackbeards and Calico Jacks of the early 18th century, the last generation of the tradition operating in the shrinking spaces that remained before the naval suppression closed them down. The closing down of the buccaneer world was a process that took decades and was never quite complete during the period when it was most active. There were always places where a man could go to be outside the system. Madagascar, the Carolinas, the less accessible coasts of various Caribbean islands. The frontier kept moving and the people who needed it kept finding it, until finally the frontier was gone and there was nowhere left to go. This closing of the frontier is a theme in the history of the early modern world that goes far beyond the Caribbean. The 16th and 17th centuries were a period of genuine frontier, of spaces outside the reach of any organized power, where different rules applied or no rules applied. These spaces attracted the people for whom the organized world had no place. And in those spaces, something different from the organized world sometimes emerged. As the 18th century progressed, the frontiers closed. The naval power of the major European states extended further. The colonial administration of the Caribbean, the Americas, and eventually Africa and Asia reached into previously ungoverned territories. The maps became accurate. The sea lanes became policed. The spaces where a man could go to be outside the system of his birth shrank and eventually disappeared. The Tortuga Republic was one of the things that filled a frontier space during the decades when the frontier was still open. It was not the only such thing, and not the most lasting, but it was, in some ways, the most fully developed, the most complete example of what people who had been rejected by European civilization could build from the materials available to them in a specific geography. And it ended the way frontiers end, not because what was built there proved unworkable, but because the world around it changed in ways that made the space it occupied no longer available. The harbor at Tortuga in the early morning before the heat comes. The water is still, or nearly still. The fishing boats are putting out. The mountains of Haiti are pale and distant across the channel. This is a place that has seen everything. The Spanish ships that first mapped it, the buccaneer sloops that sheltered here for decades, the French colonial vessels, the years of revolution and counter-revolution that produced the country visible across the water. None of it left a mark on the water itself. The water is the same water. It receives what comes into it and closes again after, and the surface is unmarked. That is what the sea does. It receives the histories that play out on and across it, and it gives nothing back, and it keeps going. The buccaneers knew this. They had chosen an element that would not remember them. That was part of what made it free. The rest is silence. The Spanish Empire that the buccaneers spent the carriers attacking was not a simple thing. It was, at its height, the largest territorial empire in human history. It controlled most of Central and South America, significant portions of North America, the Philippines, various Pacific island groups, portions of Africa, and large sections of Italy and the Low Countries in Europe. The total population under Spanish sovereignty was larger than any previous empire had governed, and yet it was structurally vulnerable in ways that were not obvious from the outside. The empire was built on a specific economic logic: the extraction of precious metals from the Americas and their transfer to Spain for use in European warfare and commerce. This logic required reliable transportation across the Atlantic, which required control of the sea lanes, which required naval power, which required money, which required the continued extraction and transfer of precious metals. The circularity of this logic was its weakness. Any disruption to the transfer mechanism, any successful raid on a treasure fleet, any successful attack on a port through which the silver flowed, any increase in the cost of defending the sea lanes, reduced the revenue available to fund the naval power that protected the revenue. The buccaneers disrupted this mechanism. Not fatally. The Spanish Empire did not fall because of the buccaneers, but consistently and at significant cost. The silver that did not make it across the Atlantic was silver that the Spanish treasury did not have. The fortifications that had to be built and the warships that had to be maintained were expenses that reduced what was available for other purposes. The cumulative effect of 40 years of buccaneer raiding on Spanish Caribbean commerce was substantial. Historians have calculated that the cost to Spain of defending its Caribbean territories in this period significantly exceeded the revenue those territories generated. The Caribbean Empire became, during the height of the buccaneer era, a net drain on the Spanish economy rather than a net contributor. This is the strategic achievement of the buccaneers. Properly understood, they did not defeat the Spanish Empire, but they imposed costs on it that contributed to its gradual weakening, at a time when the empire was already under pressure from other directions. The long wars in Europe, the revolt of the Netherlands, the growing commercial competition of England and France. The specific experience of individual Spanish colonists and sailors and merchants who encountered the buccaneers was, of course, not a matter of strategic calculation. For them, it was personal and immediate and terrifying. The Spanish colonial world of the 17th century was full of men who had heard the stories of ships taken in the open sea, of towns burned and looted, of captains and merchants tortured for the locations of their hidden valuables, of the black-hulled sloops that appeared out of nowhere and could not be outrun. The psychological effect of living under this threat was real and difficult to quantify. Some Spanish colonists left the Caribbean entirely, relocating to more secure territories. Some towns built walls and maintained militias that the peacetime economy of a small colonial settlement could barely afford. Some merchants chose not to ship at all during certain seasons when buccaneer activity was known to be high, accepting economic losses as the price of physical safety. The fear was as much a part of the buccaneers' achievement as the actual raids. A community that lived in fear of attack was a community whose economic and social development was constrained by that fear. This constraint multiplied the effect of the raids themselves. The actual damage done was significant, but the damage avoided by the Spanish in order to reduce the exposure was significant too. The buccaneers were, in this sense, a weapon of economic warfare as much as a military force. And like most effective economic weapons, their greatest effect was felt not at the moment of impact, but in the cumulative adjustment of behavior by the targets over years and decades. Henry Morgan understood this intuitively, even if he would not have described it in those terms. His choice of targets, not random ships but the cities and fortifications through which the commercial system operated, reflected an understanding that the most valuable thing to attack was the infrastructure of the system rather than its products. Take the silver and you have enriched yourself. Destroy the mechanisms through which the silver flows and you have weakened the empire. Panama was the most extreme expression of this logic. The city was not just a place where silver was stored. It was the hub through which all the silver from Peru passed on its way to Spain. To destroy Panama was to destroy, at least temporarily, the most important node in the entire Spanish-American commercial network. Morgan burned Panama and left. He did not try to hold it. He understood that holding it was impossible. Spanish forces would have retaken it within months. But he had demonstrated something important, that the most important city in Spanish America could be reached and destroyed by a force that the Spanish had not imagined capable of doing such a thing. That demonstration had effects that outlasted the rebuilding of the city. Spanish planners had to reconsider every assumption they had made about the security of the Caribbean territories. Every fortification, every convoy schedule, every defensive plan had to be revisited in the light of the knowledge that nothing was as safe as they had believed. The cost of this reconsideration, in time, in money, in the psychological energy of the administrators and military commanders who had to think through every implication, was itself a kind of victory. The world that produced the buccaneers was changing rapidly throughout the period of the greatest activity. The 17th century was a century of revolution, political, scientific, commercial, and religious, in which the assumptions that had organized European life for centuries were being challenged and, in many cases, overturned. The scientific revolution of the period, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Descartes, was producing a new understanding of the physical world that would eventually transform technology and therefore power. The commercial revolution that was making England and the Netherlands rich through joint stock companies, through systematic reinvestment of commercial profits, through the development of financial instruments that allowed capital to be organized at previously impossible scale, was changing who had resources and who had power. The political revolutions of the period, the English Civil War, the various European wars of religion, the beginning of constitutional debates about the limits of royal authority were changing how governance was understood and organized. The Buccaneers were part of this world, shaped by it, and in some small ways shaping it. The democratic arrangements of Tortuga were not isolated curiosities. They were one expression of a broader questioning of hierarchy and authority that was happening across European culture simultaneously. The coffee house debates about the social contract that were happening in London in the 1660s were happening at the same time as buccaneer crews were voting on captains and dividing plunder by agreed formula. The people in the coffee houses had access to books and philosophical tradition that the buccaneers did not. The buccaneers had access to a practical situation in which abstract questions about the basis of authority had to be answered immediately in ways that actually worked or produced immediate consequences. The cross pollination between these worlds was real, if difficult to document precisely. Men who had sailed with the buccaneers returned to Europe and brought with them stories about how the Caribbean was organized. Those stories fed into the broader cultural conversation about what kinds of social arrangements were possible. Later, political philosophers, particularly those writing about natural rights and the state of nature, would use the Americas as their primary example of what human beings were like before civilization, though they were drawing on accounts of indigenous societies rather than buccaneer ones. But the buccaneer world provided something different from the imagined state of nature. Evidence that people who had abandoned existing civilization could build new social arrangements from scratch, that these arrangements could function and persist, and that they could embody principles, consent, the right to remove leaders, compensation for injury, division of collective gains, that the more sophisticated political philosophy of the period was still working to articulate in the theoretical terms. The harbor at night, the stars bright over the Caribbean. In a way, they are not in the foggy north, from which most of these men had come. The sound of the water against the hull, someone playing music somewhere onshore, the multinational music of a multinational community, something that belonged entirely to this place and no other. These men would mostly not live long. The sea killed them, disease killed them, other men's weapons killed them, the violence of the chosen life killed them. The average career of an active buccaneer was measured in years rather than decades, and the end of that career was rarely peaceful. But in the time they had, in the years between arriving on this island with nothing and dying with approximately nothing, in the expeditions and the port nights, and the arguments and the agreements and the moments of genuine solidarity that the Shas party created, they built something, not a utopia, not a civilization in the conventional sense, not something that lasted, but something real, something that was theirs, that they had made from the materials available to them, that answered the question of how to live together among people who refused to be governed by anything they had not agreed to. The answer was imperfect and violent and limited and ultimately temporary. Most answers are: the sea outside the harbor keeps moving. It has been moving since before the first Spanish ship came through these waters, and it will keep moving long after the last tourist boat has gone home and the island has returned to whatever it was before anyone came to make history here. This is what the sea teaches, if you spend enough time with it: that the things people build are temporary and the water is permanent, and that what matters is not whether what you built lasted, but whether, while it was here, it was real. The buccaneers built something real, and then it ended, and the sea kept going. The specific men who made the buccaneer world what it was deserve individual attention, because the broad outlines of the story can obscure the texture of the individual lives that composed it. Francis Lolone was one of the most feared names in the Caribbean in the 1660s, and also one of the most disturbing. A Frenchman who had come to the Caribbean as an indentured servant and survived that experience with a particular hatred for the Spanish who had overseen his servitude. He became a buccaneer captain of genuine effectiveness and genuine cruelty. His campaigns against Spanish settlements on the Venezuelan coast in 1666 and 1667 were militarily successful by the standards of the period. He took cities, he took ships, he accumulated plunder. He was also, by the accounts of his contemporaries, extraordinarily violent in his treatment of prisoners, the kind of violence that went beyond what tactical necessity or even the brutal norms of the period required. Lolone died in approximately 1668, probably killed by the Kuna people of Darien, the indigenous inhabitants of the same jungle that Morgan would cross 3 years later. The specific circumstances of his death are uncertain. He was not mourned by anyone who had encountered him. He represents the darkest side of the buccaneer world. The freedom it offered was freedom from restraint. And for some men, the absence of restraint produced not the democratic arrangements of the Shah's party, but unchecked violence against anyone in their power. This is the honest account of what freedom means when it is available only to some people and not to others. Freedom from the constraints that organized society imposed was freedom to act on one's own inclinations without consequence. For most buccaneers, those inclinations ran to risk-taking, adventure, gambling, and the kind of rough solidarity that the Shah's party embodied. For Lolone, they ran elsewhere. Bartholomew the Portuguese was another figure, less historically prominent than Morgan, less notorious than Lolone, but in some ways more representative of the typical buccaneer career. He had several periods of success, accumulated significant plunder, lost it, was captured, escaped, recovered, and eventually disappeared from the historical record in the way that most buccaneers did, not in a dramatic final battle, but simply by ceasing to appear in the documents. His escapes were legendary in the Caribbean. Captured by Spanish forces more than once, he escaped through what contemporaries described as extraordinary physical capability and willingness to take risks that anyone else would have considered fatal. He was not a strategic thinker in Morgan's mold. He was a tactician and a survivor, a man who excelled at the immediate problem rather than the long-term planning. Most buccaneers were like Bartholomew the Portuguese rather than like Morgan. They were capable, experienced, occasionally brilliant in the moment, They were not building empires and they were not thinking about the strategic implications of their activities. They were trying to survive and to prosper in the specific conditions they found themselves in, using the tools available to them. This ordinariness is important to recover because the romantic version of Buccaneer history tends to populate it entirely with exceptional figures. The Morgans and the Lolone and the named captains who left enough of a mark to appear in the contemporary accounts. The nameless men who crewed the ships, who voted on the chasse parties, who spent their plunder in the taverns of Tortuga and Port Royal, and sometimes settled down, and sometimes did not. These men are mostly invisible in the historical record, but they were the substance of the world. The captains were the visible apex of a community that rested on their labor and their willingness to take risks and their collective agreement to the terms of the enterprise. Without them, the captains were nothing. The buccaneer world ended gradually, in different places at different times, under different pressures in different locations. There was no single moment when it stopped, no battle, no treaty, no event that closed the chapter definitively. In Tortuga specifically, the transition was managed rather than forced. The French colonial administration extended its reach over the island progressively through the 1680s and 1690s, establishing the plantation economy that would eventually make the French half of Hispaniola the most productive colonial territory in the world. The buccaneers who remained on Tortuga became planters or became marginalized figures in a colonial economy that had no particular use for the skills or left for other locations. The harbor that had sheltered their ships became a harbor for other things. The island that had been theirs, in the sense that no other authority had been able to hold it against them, became another man's colony, administered from Paris, producing tobacco and coffee and eventually sugar with the labor of people who had no chasse party, no vote, no share in what they produced. This is the final irony of the Tortuga story. The men who had rejected the hierarchies of European civilization and built something different in the Caribbean frontier ended up, when the frontier closed, participating in the most extreme hierarchy that European civilization produced, the racial slavery of the plantation economy. They had not been emancipatory figures. Their freedom was freedom for themselves, at the expense of others where necessary. The democratic arrangements of the Shas party were arrangements among equals, among men who had chosen to be there and who could choose to leave. They did not extend to the enslaved, and when the buccaneers became planters, they showed no reluctance to participate in the system that enslaved others. This is the truth that the romantic version of the story skips over, and it cannot be skipped over if the story is to be honestly told. And yet, the arrangements they built, imperfect, limited, ultimately complicit in larger systems of exploitation, were real. The Shas party was real. The democratic captaincy was real. The insurance provisions were real. The community that formed on this rocky island, that negotiated its own rules and enforced them through collective agreement rather than through imposed authority, was real. It did not last. It was not extended to everyone it should have been extended to. It was absorbed back into the systems it had briefly escaped. But for a few decades, in this specific place, something different was attempted. And that attempt is worth knowing about, worth thinking about, worth sitting with in the dark before sleep. The Caribbean night is warm. The stars are close. The water moves against the rocks with a sound that has not changed in 400 years. The buccaneers are gone. What they built is gone. The place remains. One more thing deserves to be said before this story ends. Something about legend and what it does to reality. The Buccaneers became legendary almost immediately. Stories about them circulated in the Caribbean and then in Europe within years of the events they described. Alexander Exquemelin, who had been a buccaneer himself, published his account of the Caribbean raiders in 1678, while Morgan was still alive, while Port Royal was still at its height, while the buccaneer era had not yet clearly ended. His book was an immediate success. It was translated into English, French, German, and Spanish within years of its first publication. The book shaped how the Buccaneers were understood by European audiences, who had no other way to access the reality. And the book was not simply neutral reportage. Exquemelin had his own perspective, his own scores to settle, his own understanding of what the story meant. Morgan sued him for libel over some of the characterizations and won a settlement. The book still circulated, the settlement notwithstanding. This is how legends begin, not with a deliberate fabrication, but with the combination of real events, personal perspective, and a readership hungry for the story. The Caribbean raiders were exotic enough, their world different enough from the experience of European readers, their actions dramatic enough that the reality required very little embellishment to be compelling. The embellishment came anyway. Later writers added details. The romantic tradition of the 18th and 19th centuries transformed the buccaneer into a figure of adventure literature. The free spirit, the man outside society's constraints, the romantic outlaw whose violence was justified by the system's prior injustice to him. This romantic tradition is not entirely false. There are genuine elements of the reality that support the romance. The self-governance, the democratic arrangements, the rejection of hierarchy, the genuine courage required by the life. But the romantic tradition selects from the reality, and what it selects leaves out the elements that are harder to romanticize. The violence, the exploitation, the limitations of who was included in the freedom. The pirate of popular culture, the figure of the eye patch and the black flag, and the romantic freedom, is a simplified version of the buccaneer of Tortuga. The simplification is not meaningless. It preserves something that is worth preserving. The idea that people who have been excluded from the organized world can build something of their own, that freedom is possible even for those the system has rejected, that the hierarchies of birth and class are not the only way to organize human life. These ideas are worth preserving. They are part of what makes the Tortuga story interesting beyond its surface details. But the full story, the one that includes Lolone and the enslaved Africans and the plantation economy that the Buccaneers helped build, is more interesting than the simplified version. Because the full story is about real people trying to solve real problems in real conditions, and the solutions they found were partial and limited and complicated. And that complexity is what makes them recognizable as human beings rather than figures in a legend. The Caribbean, today, carries all of these histories simultaneously. The tourist who arrives at a Caribbean beach sees one layer. The resident who lives there sees others. The historian who works in the archives sees others still. The descendants of the enslaved people who built the plantation economy that replaced the Buccaneer Republic carry that history in their bodies and their culture in ways that no amount of reading can fully access from outside. Tortuga itself, Ile de la Tortue, is not a tourist destination in the way that other Caribbean islands are. It is a poor island, part of the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. the history of Haiti that surrounds it, the revolution that destroyed the plantation system, the centuries of poverty and exploitation, and natural disaster and political failure that followed, is present in a way that makes the Buccaneer history seem very distant. But the cliffs are still there. The harbor is still there. The water is still the impossible blue of the Caribbean, turning to green near the shore, turning to black in the deep water offshore. The fishing boats go out. The sun moves across the sky and touches the mountains of Haiti, visible across the channel. The night comes in the way Caribbean nights come, quickly, warmly, with stars that are different from any other place. This is where it happened. Not in a legend, not in a novel, not in a video game with accurate looking ships and anachronistic dialogue. In this specific place, with this specific harbor and these specific cliffs, real people built something real for a few decades, and then it ended and the sea kept going. That is the whole story. Not the whole of what happened, the whole of what can be said about what it means. That it happened, that it was real, that people who had nothing built something from nothing in conditions that the organized world could not imagine, and that something, imperfect, violent, partial, temporary, was for his brief time genuinely theirs. The water comes in, the water goes out. The cliffs hold the light for a moment at the end of the day and then release it. The Buccaneers of Tortuga. Real people, real place, real history. Sleep now. The end.